Europe's recent economic history has been largely categorised by debt crises, ageing populations, a lack of innovation and investment, all resulting in general wide-reaching economic stagnation. But for a while now, that's all come with one major exception: Poland. The country on the surface looks like a modern economic success story, growing from a poor satellite state of the failing USSR to today, where it's the fastest growing major economy on the continent. What's more is that it's seemingly avoiding a lot of the pitfalls of its EU peers. Debt to GDP is very manageable, its population is ageing but not as rapidly as other advanced economies, and most of all, it genuinely seems to be innovating, producing new technologies and reinvesting into tools and systems that make its people more economically productive. Now, if this can work for Poland, a country with a rather comprehensive list of genuine macroeconomic challenges, the most logical action would be to take what's working here and do it for the rest of Europe. Current global economic factors might, in a perverse way, force the EU to take these ideas more seriously. But with that, it's also important to acknowledge that Poland is by no means flawless. For all of its success, it's still well behind most of the more established European economies, and they have in turn fallen well behind the USA as the most logical point of comparison. In an environment like the EU, it's arguably easier to catch up, but getting ahead is another issue entirely. If it really wants to turn its economic success into an economic miracle, it's going to need to keep growing, and to keep growing, it's going to need to offer something that a lot of stagnating economies in Europe cannot. So, what have been the driving forces of Poland's growth? What challenges could potentially put an end to this miracle? And finally, how is it differentiating itself from its more mature economic peers in the EU? Let's take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, Surfshark. Now, while Poland is investing in tools to make its people more economically productive, for the rest of us online, our personal data is often the product. Every time you browse, companies, advertisers, and even your local internet provider can track what you're doing, sometimes without you even realising it, and that's where Surfshark comes in. Surfshark is a VPN, or virtual private network, that encrypts your internet traffic and hides your IP address, keeping your private information, well, private. It also lets you change your device's digital location with one click. For example, I'm soon going on a longer trip to Europe and I've been checking prices for things like train tickets using different location settings. Because, let me tell you, those prices can look very different when you're browsing from Australia versus locally. Surfshark works on unlimited devices, has a strict no-logs policy, and includes features like Clean Web, which blocks ads, trackers, and malware before they even load. Right now, Surfshark is offering Economics Explained viewers a special deal. Use code ECONOMICS at checkout to get 4 months extra of Surfshark VPN completely free. Thanks again to Surfshark for supporting the channel, and now back to the video. As Poland and other Warsaw Pact countries detached from the Eastern Bloc in the 1990s, many of them struggled with severe economic hardship. After all, if everything in the Cold War economy was going great for Mother Russia, there would be no need for government reform in the first place. Out of desperation, most of these newly independent entities introduced shock therapy, transitioning from a centrally planned economy to a free market system, at least in part, as current institutions were widely failing. What separated Poland from other nations, however, was the way in which they transitioned from public to private, favouring slow, competitive change over immediate arbitrary experiments. Of course, this was arguably the most important decision they could have made. Russia, Ukraine, Hungary, Moldova, and others decided to rip the band-aid off quickly, leaving them vulnerable to unchecked oligarchies seizing privatised industries for themselves. Poland's approach, although sharing the same goal, was far more multifaceted. Instead of selling off state assets to a small circle, they held public offerings, encouraged foreign investment, and introduced employee stock ownership plans. And, without a small circle of monopoly men pushing all the buttons, Poland's developing marketplace was motivated to reduce corruption with new policies. Choosing a slow transition in order to prevent a chaotic rat race to the finish line, they encouraged newly privatised businesses to compete with pre-existing government-owned businesses of the past. The little victories of this method were initially overlooked. Poland was in such a terrible shape that it had a GDP per capita of $1,700, less than 10% of what was seen in the West. However, the gap has been narrowing dramatically, while those that were once dwarfed it are slowing down. Today, with a population of around 40 million people, Poland has managed to garner a tremendous amount of attention from economists, with some arguing that it could act as a lifeline for Europe in the coming decades. In fact, it's been so impressive that economists have projected that Poland will likely to continue to see similar growth leading into 2030. There are a few other factors that have developed in Poland that have made it particularly interesting in our modern global economy. For starters, Poland has been a long-time member of the EU, and that membership has arguably benefited its bottom line more than any other country in Europe. They are the largest EU cohesion fund recipient, totaling 213 billion euros or 220 billion US dollars, and this is only suspected to grow into 2027. Now, this can potentially come with a series of complications. While this assistance and improvement can be helpful, it also has the potential to do the exact opposite. For poor members, the Free Work Agreement of the EU has seen a lot of their most talented workers move to richer countries in the Union, where they can earn more money, often working in better conditions. This problem only compounds when struggling countries have also had to deal with a currency that's been kept high by wealthy export economies like Germany, which in times of economic crisis has meant that their currency couldn't fall like it probably would have if they had their own currency. This was particularly pronounced in Greece and Spain during the GFC and the Eurozone crisis. If they still had their own currency while they were struggling, their debts would be easier to manage and a deflated currency would make their exports and tourism more competitive, helping to boost their income. But with the euro, that didn't really happen. Even in less extreme circumstances, conducting monetary policy that is both ideal for a slower, more established economy like Germany and a rapidly developing economy like Poland is really hard, and ultimately is always going to be a compromise. Of course, this isn't meant to put the Eurozone on trial here. Generally, it's agreed that the benefits have outweighed the costs, especially for growing economies like Poland, but it's also important to acknowledge that those costs do exist. There are a number of major advantages though. The single market promoting free movement of goods, services and capital has resulted in increased consumer confidence and healthy competition, and it undoubtedly gives participating countries a fair amount of incentive to work towards common interest for the sake of the whole. Moreover, the argument could be made that the group has become a scapegoat for stagnation, as the UK, since its detachment from the programme, has experienced similar struggles virtually identical to those experienced by the rest of the Eurozone. Not to mention that, without cooperation within the EU, Poland would almost certainly not be where it is today. What actually sets Poland apart from these starting to falter is how they participate. As Poland has so far refused to use the euro as their official currency, technically separating it from the Eurozone, while still serving various functions within the organisation. It's allowed them to remain autonomous-ish and avoid having to compromise as much on monetary policy, helping with inflation, as well as better manage exchange rates to buffer against major shocks. Of course, they're feeling the pain in some areas as they are still connected to the region's highs and lows, just not as much. Plus, perhaps most importantly, there's the matter of how they've been using EU funding to their advantage, being far more conscientious than others receiving the assistance. Over the past decade, the country's done a fairly good job of diversifying, prioritising services and technology. Its automotive industry, for example, has become its fourth largest employer, now accounting for 11% of the country's total industrial output and 4% of its GDP. And this has been great in terms of foreign direct investment from companies like Fiat, Toyota and Volkswagen, whose interest has only increased in recent years given the significant push towards electric vehicles and their respective patented tech and batteries. They've also leveraged this position in a broad sense to act in some ways like the tech hub of Europe, something that other countries have famously struggled with, particularly when it comes to information and communication technology. With an immense amount of effort, Poland's ICT market has grown to $26.5 billion, showing year-on-year growth of over 4%. In an economy that wasn't huge to begin with, this seriously strengthened their GDP in a highly technical and value-adding field. It's this same focus that's led to the continual development of education and skilled labour, with 66,000 students enrolled in ICT-related studies, 430,000 employees in IT, leading to a growing pool of talent. This is crucial because, as a whole, Poland has been staring down the barrel of a middle-income trap for some time now. Using purchasing power parity, they've been on the cusp of achieving high-income status, but have consistently fallen short, causing a case of brain drain, at least historically. But they aren't the only country that has suffered from this phenomenon. They aren't even the worst. And the way they've been combating this loss of skilled labour is amongst the most interesting case studies that the rest of the continent should be taking seriously. One of the ways they've been combating this is through reduced income tax for young workers under the age of 26 since 2019. Yet if this was the only thing they were doing to reduce drainage, it probably wouldn't do enough to slow it that much. It's more so connected to programs like Digital Poland, a project that aims to enhance digital capabilities, including support for startups, innovation and digital infrastructure, increasing funding for research and development in cities like Warsaw, Krakow and Wrocław, who have acted as growing tech hubs for the last 20-some years. This has fostered a lot of technical innovation, which just by itself is attractive to a lot of young workers. Polish workers can and do make a lot more money by moving to work for established companies in places like Germany, but there they'll be a cog in a very stagnant machine. Poland's counteroffer has been that their salaries aren't as high, but technical young workers will get to contribute to cutting-edge projects that more established economic centres just don't have the appetite for. In other words, luring skilled workers across the border with living standards and a better paycheck can obviously be very effective. People love security. But if an industry player can sell the promise that you'll learn more and feel like a meaningful team player, young people will be inspired to stick around, even if the venture is a little bit more risky, because in the long run their value will still increase. Now this is also great for workers because they get a choice. The exciting path or the safe path. There is no right or wrong, and it also helps that even though the salaries are a lot lower in Polish cities, the cost of living is as well, so quality of life these days is significantly improved from where it was even 2 decades ago. This method has been a win-win for Poland so far, as what they might lack in high income status compared to other countries, they're making up for by acting as a budding Silicon Valley, attracting foreign and domestic investment as Europe's rising innovator, which has resulted in a dramatic drop in brain drain, particularly over the last few years. Now, beyond EU funding and R&D, there is one more significant contributor to Poland's economic growth, and that's military spending. In comparison to most other countries in NATO, Poland is amongst the leading contributors to an ongoing arms race, becoming one of the most military capable nations in Europe, along with Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Greece. Something that is probably only going to accelerate as Europe moves away from the US and towards more self-sufficient defence. And look, this isn't a military channel, but spending is spending, and it's playing a progressively massive role in the Polish economy. Aside from plans to recruit almost 500,000 more troops, the country has been making a ton of deals to secure military equipment, and the shift towards European-centred military contractors will be another massive industrial opportunity for the country. Economically, this is a multifaceted issue, creating a set of burdens and benefits. Starting with the former, this is of course, without outside assistance, unsustainable. Military spending in Poland has grown by over 300% in just the last decade. Now, a lot of this spending will be one-time acquisitions of new hardware, but all of that needs to be maintained and eventually replaced. Walking back significant military spending is incredibly difficult. But with the invasion of Ukraine on their doorstep and question marks about the function of NATO into the future, they don't have much of a choice. Historically, Poland has been a bit of a punching bag during global conflicts, and they've made significant investments to make sure that doesn't happen again. That is, if the time ever comes. And in the meantime, it is still a major expense. They have been able to slow this debt down with things like the Armed Forces Support Fund, complex financial mechanisms like loans and bonds issuances, budgetary adjustments, along with aforementioned capital investments, but there's a high likelihood that this will result in serious fiscal strain in the not-so-distant future. Now, on the flip side, although war is an ugly prospect, it does contribute to the economy in more ways than just creating unstoppable boom death machines. Among the obvious benefits is that, albeit temporarily, this does reduce unemployment, while, when done effectively, provide skilled labour in the civilian sectors for later opportunities down the line. Also, with new bases comes new infrastructure, which means better roads, dual-use facilities like hospitals and cybersecurity that, once tested, will benefit private communication. One of the unique benefits that doesn't apply to all countries, just mainly Eastern Europe in this context, is mounting tensions with Russia in the realm of energy. In an effort to circumvent their reliance on fossil fuels, as Russia was and is a major supplier to much of the West, Poland has steered its focus towards sustainable ways to produce power with its very first nuclear power plant. This is a long-term and expensive construction project, but the Simpsons-era stigma around this sort of thing has since faded, and a reliable source of energy is one of the strongest predictors of long-term economic prosperity. So from R&D to fiscal responsibility to infrastructure, all of this is impressive and worthy of the headlines Poland's been receiving. However, they still aren't really in line with the truly developed EU countries like Germany, France, and especially places like the Netherlands. And that's after they've been stagnant for almost 2 decades now. So is Poland just playing catch-up, or is it actually on track to grow past these stagnant players? Well, nobody can predict the future, least of all economists, but there are things worth considering that could make this at least feasible in the long term. It's definitely outpacing other middle-income countries like Greece, and given the current struggles seen in Spain, there is a fair amount of predictions that Poland will pass them in due time. Germany is Europe's dominant economy, but they face their own bundle of challenges like energy policy and other slowdowns that have significantly affected growth rates. France's economy is strong, but it's also one of the highest public debt ratios in the EU, expected to rise to about 117% of GDP by 2026. COVID hit them extremely hard, and they're just now starting to pull back and get things under control. It's also important to point out that Poland's military spending is, at least in part, one of the reasons they didn't suffer the same kind of pandemic lows as their neighbours did at the turn of the decade. And taking all of the spending information from before into account, this still leaves the country vulnerable to debt concerns leading up to 2030 if outside funding were to slow down or stop for whatever reason. Also, for now, lower incomes have been attractive to foreign companies looking to set up cheaper manufacturing centres that are still within the EU. If they catch up and those incomes become comparable to the more established economies within the EU, that investment is probably going to slow down. All of this is to say that Poland has definitely seen unprecedented growth, and the way that this growth has manifested has encouraged foreign investment in their most profitable sectors because they've been so trustworthy. But surpassing leading nations, even as they stagnate, is an incredibly tall order, and there are a couple of reasons for this. The first is that much of Poland's growth has been entirely dependent on these stagnant economies, so if they start to fail, Poland will have to look elsewhere to keep on expanding, and while they're not exactly landlocked, they've undoubtedly profited from proximity in a way that they wouldn't have if they only traded with the US or China. Even still, though it may not have the most enviable neighbours, any outstanding resource advantages, or long-established wealth, it's playing extremely well with the cards it's been dealt. If it can maintain innovation as it has been, reward its workforce as it reaches high income status, and avoid typical pitfalls of unmanageable debt, it could certainly be a major player in the region, and at the very least, a decent case study into what the rest of the continent could look to save themselves. Now, we made an entire video on the general stagnation of the EU last year, which should give some context to the exact challenges that Poland has so far managed to sidestep. We didn't want to repeat too much here, but as always, you should be able to click to that video on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.